Thank you all for joining us today. SAIS is thrilled and honored to be able to make this information available to as wide an audience as possible. Throughout this spring, we have focused our Lunch and Learn series on data, beginning with information collected by researchers at Vanderbilt University on strategic effectiveness of governance structures, continuing with a deep dive into one particular student assessment, and culminating today in a look at the variety of assessment tests that are available to independent schools, how to select the ones that are most appropriate to your school, and how to use them to gain insights into learner profiles and make the kinds of 21st century changes we are all eager to make. Our presenter today is Jonathan E. Martin, who has 15 years experience as an independent school principal or head, most recently as head of St. Gregory College Preparatory School in Tucson, Arizona. As head of St. Gregory, he implemented next-generation assessments such as the NWEA MAP testing, the HSSSE surveys, and the CWRA assessment. He instituted a one-to-one laptop program for grades 6 through 12, developed a new student report card model called the Essential Goals for Gregorians, trained teachers in 21st century project-based learning, and launched a new student advisory program. Jonathan speaks often on 21st century learning at national, regional, and state conferences, and we're quite happy to have him with us today. Jonathan?
Yes, thank you, Damien. Thanks for that nice introduction. Good morning, everyone, from Tucson, Arizona. I hope it's as beautiful where you are now as it is here, although perhaps some of you in parts of the South are having rain. But I'm very happy to talk about a topic I care really deeply about and believe fervently in, that we can strengthen our schools, we can improve student learning using new and effective and alternative, broader-based assessment methods. And I do so, I say that in the face of opposition, in the face of in the moment of an era when there's a backlash against testing and assessment and measurement in schools, when the opt-out movement is crossing the country, sort of raising up hackles about over-testing and inappropriate testing. And I want to say that, just quickly point out that I think the anti-testing movement at its base is about opposition to using the wrong kinds of tests in the wrong kinds of ways for the wrong kinds of purposes. But that shouldn't be taken to mean that we we oughtn't use the right kinds of tests in the right kinds of ways for the right kinds of purposes. That's the answer. The answer is not to abandon testing altogether. It's to use it correctly, to use it, for our purposes and our goals. And I think there's every opportunity to do so. And indeed, I think we have something of a responsibility to do so, to advance student learning and to strengthen our institutions. Quickly, my own background here is that in addition to what Damien was so nice to say about my career work in schools, I've been spending the last 4 or 5 years working very hard and thinking about new and different and better assessment systems, including writing a user's guide for the PISA test for schools, or the OECD test for schools based in PISA, for the mission skills assessment, and a forthcoming guide this spring, coming out in May or June, on the high school survey of student engagement from NAIS. And I've done work as well with SSAT on their study of the future of assessments. That's a report available on the SSAT website. I've done work for Blackbaud on grading and assessing student work online. That's freely available over at Blackbaud. And I'm working right now a lot on a system called Tessera, a new non-cognitive or character strengths assessment system for social emotional learning that isn't available yet. It's in research. We are looking for pilot schools, by the way, that will be forthcoming next school year. So all of these systems, these non-cognitive and cognitive measurement systems, tests, and assessments are things I'm affiliated with, I've done work for. I'm not an entirely neutral observer to this, and so you should be forewarned that I have my own professional affiliations with various testing and measurement operations. This quote from Grant Wiggins is among my greatest inspirations, and of course many of us are great big fans of the late, great Grant, and his passing just under a year ago, last June, was a terrible shock and great loss for our profession. But in this book, and this is a terrific book, and perhaps more than any other book guides my work, is the idea that first and foremost, school leaders need to know that our job, the most important thing about our job is to close the gaps, to identify and close the gaps between what we promise to do for our students and what actually happens, between the results we seek and the performances students are able to generate on measures that matter. And I underline measures that matter in order to honor this sort of purpose or call by Grant Wiggins, and Jay Mateague. We need to make sure we have the measures that matter in place. We can't do this work. We can't close these gaps. We can't know whether we're fulfilling what we're seeking to do if we don't have measures that capture what we're seeking to do and do so well. A second inspirational quote for me comes from one of the leaders, excuse me, of the college and universities, which in some ways, of course, parallel independent schools more than public schools, right? In the sense that they're independent institutions, they're accountable to accreditation, but not to district and states, education authorities. Colleges have a lot to teach us, and colleges are working through how are they knowing how much their students are learning. And so there's some thought leaders in the college world that I look to often. And I love this quote about assessment is about revolution. It's only through really seeking out and checking whether we're doing what we say we do, whether we're accomplishing what we want to, that we can challenge ourselves. And I think every school, and independent schools included, need to challenge themselves a little bit more than they have been. And there's a lot of that happening today, to rethink our ways of teaching, our structuring of the curriculum, and what it means to know. So this is another inspiration for me. This isn't so much an inspiration as a mandate. This is, and I'm sure Damien's familiar with Criterion 13, which comes from the NAIS Commission on Accreditation, and it's a mandate not directly to schools. It's a mandate to accrediting associations that they require of their schools in the accreditation process, evidence of a thoughtful process, respectful of mission for the school's mission. And it doesn't say the breadth of the mission, but I'm going to suggest there it ought to be the breadth of the mission for the collection and use in school decision-making of data, both external and internal, about student learning. Which is to say that for independent school accreditation, schools need to make sure they are using data, they're collecting it from both their own internal systems and from some external checks. And that's what we're going to talk about today, external tools and resources to evaluate and measure their student learning, and those measures be respectful of your mission. And we'll return to that topic soon. I pause here for a second, in a sense, to pull back and just raise the question. Much of the premise of my discussion today and my argument in my work is that if we have better tests, if we have the right kinds of tests and assessments and measurement systems, we can thereby use them to positively impact instruction, to improve the work of the school in delivering the curriculum and accomplishing the goals of the school. And that question is, I want to surface that question for just a moment. This is a tiny tangent. I want to surface that question and say, that premise we ought to test. We ought to sort of check to see if it's true. Maybe, and there are some out there, some of the more strident and extreme voices in the opt-out movement argue against such a claim. They're like, no, tests exist in a world of themselves and have no ability to influence instruction. And so this premise was put to the study, an empirical and thorough study by the RAND Corporation, the researchers in California who very seriously approach questions of and issues and generate research findings about them. And they wrote a report, and it's a neat little report called New Assessments, Better Instruction, ? Can they? Can we design better tests to promote instructional improvement? Can that have the purpose it wants to? And they're finding in this fine report, it's easy to read, it's free online if you're interested, is yes, they can. The premise has been proven when, and there are some caveats here, the content and the format of test ought to mirror high quality instruction. They ought to have they ought to reflect what we know about teaching and learning. They ought to reflect engagement for students and meaning and motivation for students. They ought to respect sort of best practices there. Teachers need to be supported in interpreting the scores. Teachers need to know and be assisted in better making use of the results, the data that comes out of that. And that's no small task, and it's an important responsibility of school leaders to attend to. The test scores, they're trying to walk a line here. They need to matter, but they need not to matter too much or in the wrong ways. We shouldn't be evaluating teachers with them. We shouldn't be firing teachers with them, or at least not too emphatically or exclusively. But we ought to sort of give attention to them and say, you know what, we're going to make decisions about our programs with these test scores. It should be, any use of external tests ought to be part of a broader system. We ought to make sure that we're not doing just a standardized test once a year by itself and not along the way doing other ways, internal approaches to testing or assessing in similar kinds of ways that are giving feedback to students along this course of the school year. They ought to be part of a formative and summative system. And they ought to be a component of the school-wide effort to reform itself, to advance itself, to improve itself. Damien said at the beginning here that all of our schools, all of the SAIS schools, all of the independent schools nationally are working to become the school they want to be in the 21st century. They have a sense of direction. They're going somewhere, and assessment is used as part of that broader systemic effort. So a little establishment there that, yes, tests can be used for the purposes we want them to. And then a quick reference over to what's happening in public ed, and I won't make too much of this, but I do think that we ought to be well aware of the big changes happening there, and even if they don't directly influence us, of course we ought to be informed by them. Some of our parents are going to be asking us to explain how we're doing, meeting or matching or paralleling what they're doing, or why what we're doing is better or different from what they're doing. And the particular piece here in the new ESSA law, or Every Student Succeeds Act, ESSA, which was passed in December by the Congress. It's actually kind of amazing. The Congress got something done and signed a new law, an important new law, is the argument in ESSA is one of the main claims in ESSA, and they've taken away the heavy-handed punitive measures of NCLB. They aren't calling for school closings in the same kind of way. In some ways, it's a big step back from or away from the extremes and the inappropriate heavy-handed pieces of NCLB. But they also have added something that some of us are really interested in, which is the idea that schools need to be held accountable to. They need to collect and measure and use for their ongoing development data about more than intellectual or academic achievements. They need to also measure and include as part of their school improvement plans, as part of their success measures, one or more non-academic measures. And we're going to see examples of that across the country as schools look to, and I have a headline from the New York Times up there in the upper left, testing for joy and grit. Schools are pushing, and this is an argument largely about public schools, to measure students' emotional skills. Social and emotional skills. And that's because of the new ESSA law calling and requiring for that, requiring that. And so that's something for us to be keeping our eye on as well. It's very controversial, and I pulled out a few other headlines here from places saying, no, we're not ready for that, or that's not going to be a good idea. I think it is a good idea, and I think we can, but I make reference to the controversy. But this is part of what's happening in the country nationally. ASCD, and I was telling Damien, I was just out there annual conference in Atlanta 2 weeks ago, has a new agenda as to accompany their whole child movement, and they're calling for multi-metric accountability systems that schools ought to be held accountable to, hold themselves accountable to, be held by their districts or states accountable to many different metrics put together, put alongside each other into a system of assessments. And they're looking for those multi-metrics to include both academic and non-academic or non-cognitive measures of student growth and development and learning. And their main example in this, and this is a fun little report, free online, multi-metric accountability systems. You can look at that, mostly about public ed, but still informing to us. Their main example is a group of California school districts. Almost 10 of them, about 10 urban school districts now representing over 1 million students, have come together in what's called core, the core districts. And if there's a single slide in this whole presentation to take the most look at, I think it's this one in a way. And we don't have accountability in the same way in independent schools, but whether it's our boards holding us accountable on an internal basis, or it's an accrediting association holding us accountable for accreditation, or it's our parents saying to us, how are you doing? How do you know how well you're doing? How do what is your commitment and how do you measure your success? I think that this is a model to look for and saying, what, we hold ourselves accountable, or we are being held accountable to in this case, 60-40. Maybe at your school it would be 50-50. Maybe in your school it would be 80-20. That's okay, just as long as it's sort of, my argument would be, just as long as it sort of reflects the breadth of what we're trying to accomplish. And of course we have academics on one side, and we continue to, math and English and perhaps science, academic achievement rates. And then on the other side, we have social, emotional, culture, and climates. These other factors of school life that we know are, and school promises that we know are so important. And in these California districts are balancing them out, are saying we're going to proceed and progress on both fronts and measure and hold ourselves, and quantify our success on both sides of this equation. I pulled out just one SAIS school as an example, but I'm almost sure I could have gone to any SAIS member school, just 80 or 90% of them at least, and found something in their mission statement that sounded like this, that reflected, and I have friends would love it, and it's a great school, but there are lots and lots of schools. I don't really mean to single it out, but to use it as an example, to show that in almost every case, the missions, the promises, the commitments of independent schools do reflect that same kind of two-sided balance. They are committed to intellectual, academic, cognitive growth and achievement, and to the whole child, the character and the social, emotional, and the other kinds of strengths that kids grow in on that side of the equation. And if that's what our missions say, we ought to deliver upon them and hold ourselves accountable by measuring both of them, is my argument. All right, so here you see my little graphic that roughly, loosely parallels the core districts graphic. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, and I'm going to keep moving here. We're going to look at some better and more effective ways, I think, of measuring student academic and intellectual growth formatively and powerfully with computer adaptive testing in the MAP, and then the higher order thinking skills, the kind of problem solving, critical thinking, analytic reasoning, writing effectiveness that is measured in the CWRA and PISA testing. And then we're going to look at the ways in which we can measure climate and culture, and the ways in which we can measure social emotional learning. And I would suggest, I think that each of these 4 boxes ought to be filled by every school, but that's my own little sort of point of view. And you might tinker with some of these and say, well, I don't know, or I want to add one. Some schools might add, some things to do with, other parts of their mission as well. But to me, as I try to simplify and break it down, I think these are the 4 boxes that every school should fill, and I'm going to give you suggestions for how to fill each one of them in what follows. So the measures of academic progress, I don't know how many schools use them. They're widely used in public schools, but they're starting to be used more and more in independent schools, usually as an alternative to the ERB. CTP testing, which many private schools use, independent schools use, sometimes is an alternative to the Iowa test of basic skills, which I think is being phased out anyway, and schools are in some cases looking for alternatives. I really like the MAP test. I myself, in 2009, transferred the independent school I had, switched over from ERB testing to MAP testing, and found it a really great advantage for our school, our students, our teachers, in being able to help individual students. I have a quote here from an independent school in Ohio that says, this is a much more aligned with what we're trying to do as a school. We're not trying to just get a read on what the students are doing as a class as a whole, what our median performance is for all fourth graders compared to other independent schools, and saying, well, look, ours are better than all independent schools, or they're about the same, so we're doing fine. No. This is a way to actually target and support and develop individual student learning, one student at a time, using these kinds of tools. This MAP testing is computer adaptive, which means that in a much quicker time, you get a much closer read on what students are doing, how they're doing, how well they're growing and learning, because every student has a different testing experience. Computer adaptive, if you don't know, something's called CAT, computer adaptive testing, is where it's online, it's computer-based, of course, and students, each question they take, if they get the answer right, they get a harder question to follow. If they get the question wrong, they get an easier question. And so you can imagine how quickly every student is taking a different test within the first 5 or 10 minutes. And because students don't have to answer a lot of questions that are either way too easy for them or way too hard for them, we can dive in the same amount of time or less time than a traditional standardized test, a flat test it's sometimes called. We can go deeper into what they can actually do. You do them more than once a year, but they don't take as much time, so you can accommodate that. You can provide that testing experience more than once a year, so that you can get more frequent updates on their growth and what support and challenging they need. You get great reports on how students are growing as a whole. Individual students and your students as a whole are growing over time. And if you want to hold yourself to this, you want to set goals to say, we want to see our students grow more than the average school. Are our students growing more than the average public school? Or are they growing more than the average private school? You can demonstrate that with MAP testing, which of course is what it's really all about. You get rapid feedback to teachers who can, and detailed analysis, much deeper analysis of their proficiency, and then guidance for what to teach next or how to support their continued growth. This is a powerful system. It doesn't cost much more than the ERB. Sample question here. They get to use a calculator in this case, but not in every case. Here's a drag and drop kind of problem from the MAP testing, where they have to, to do a little reading and logical analysis here, and thinking about that as they answer these questions. And then you get these kinds of progress reports on student growth over time in each of the 3 tested area. Oh, this is mathematics. And in the students' progress compared to various norms, and how they're progressing is quarter by quarter, 3 times a year. Teachers get really tremendous reports about where their students are at, and whether their students are growing according to the goals they've set for them, or the goals that would be traditionally set for this grade level. And then teachers get class breakdowns by where students are at on each of the different major areas, in this case math, and have a sense of how to group students, or what kind of resources to provide to groups of students, whether they're doing formal or informal grouping, where to focus, what students need, what kind of support going forward. It's a really awesome resource. And then you get different kinds of curricular guidance as well about these are what you might want to be working on next, skills and concepts to develop, skills and concepts to enhance. This is a terrific formative assessment. This isn't. This is testing for learning, testing to support the teaching model, and not to check, well, how did we do last year, which I think too often, too much standardized testing does. Let's move on to, I know I'm going fast. These slides will be available. You can contact me afterwards. You have my contact information. Always happy to talk more about this. I want to talk about higher order thinking skills assessment. I sometimes go higher order thinking skills, things like critical thinking, problem solving, analytical reasoning, writing effectiveness. I sometimes go to this book that I don't know if anybody on the audience has read. Book was published in 2011, so it's just a little bit starting to date now, but it's a really powerful book about college learning. But what's so tragic about this book is the conclusion it makes. It comes to these researchers that many students, nearly half of all college students, aren't learning in college. They aren't any better at the end of their college careers than they were in the beginning of their college careers, in reading complicated documents and making sense of them, in writing extended essays, analyzing a problem and proposing solutions to it, in thinking and problem solving and writing. They aren't any better at them than they were at the beginning. About half of all college students. About half of college students do grow. And what's fascinating in their study and their research is that the students who grow the most in their college years, that advance the most in their higher order thinking skills, are the ones who come in at the top, who do the best in the beginning. There's a Matthew effect. The rich get richer here. The strongest students get stronger in college. The weaker students don't get any stronger. So we have an obligation in our K-12 program to set our kids on a path towards the greatest success in college. And how do we know if they're having these skills, if they're developing those kinds of thinking and problem solving skills? Our teachers might think they are, and sometimes our teachers are right, but sometimes our teachers aren't right, or they're too blinded by their biases, or aren't sure how to test and assess those kinds of thinking skills. We need another system to check on that. The CWRA, which I know there was already a presentation on, so I'll just run through this part quickly. But if you want a deeper dive in the CWRA, you should look to the SAIS webinars to find the full program on this. But I used this test for 3 years. I think it's a really awesome experience for kids. By and large, my students enjoyed taking this test. It's been highly rated by Tony Wagner, among others, as a test worth teaching to, as a test entirely aligned with 21st century thinking skills. Students get a scenario. They get usually some graphics to go with that scenario. They get a role. You're, in this case, an intern for a senator. You need to write a memo to the senator about whether, in this case, to do a tax on junk food. Often these scenarios, more often than not, have some kind of connection to kids' lives. It's about texting and driving, or it's about loitering in shopping malls, or it's about junk food tax. It's about things that actually are connected to their own lived experience. And then there's a series of documents that accompany the scenario. In this example, there are documents like a study on the relationship, a political cartoon, a blog posting that they have to sort through, read, think about, and apply in their essay. This is a different one I'm going to run through quickly, about a crime reduction, acting as a consultant to the mayor, and weighing the strengths and weaknesses of 2 different policy initiatives. And then they get a series of documents they have to read, interpret. They always include statistics, graphs, charts. They include different kinds of writing formats. You can see here a whole assemblage of additional documents that must be reviewed as part of the exercise. This takes students about 45 minutes or an hour to read, evaluate, and then write their essay. There's a very comprehensive rubric that's applied that just by itself, the CWRA rubric, and I'll say this about PISA as well, is a good resource for schools. You can, schools that do the CWRA or the PISA, which I'm going to talk about in a minute, try to map those kinds of testing back into their own as testing and assessment. Can you, use these kinds of rubrics in your own classroom assessment and then make them line up? The CWRA, I should say, is available for grades 6 through 12. And then you get a report like this that shows not just how your students are doing and how they're doing compared to various norms. And you can see the bottom at the bottom there's norms including all public schools and all NAIS schools. and how your students are doing comparatively. But you can also look at so-called effect size. How much are your students growing from wherever it is they start? Because, of course, some schools, public or private, have mostly very high achieving ninth graders, and who, just by the virtue of their admission process and their selectivity, are already excellent students. And some students, by virtue of their more open admission or their more, other kinds of dynamics in their school, don't start off with such high performing sets of students. But that second kind of school, with a more diverse student body in the beginning, may actually do a better job of lifting their student body over the course of 4 years. And you can get that lift measurement. What value did you add? What was the size of your effect on students? And compare that to all other schools, which is really, in some ways, a much more important, much more interesting statistic to look at. There's lots more we could say about the CWRA, but there's available in the other webinar, and I'm always happy to talk more about that. Let's look at the PISA test for schools, which is being used by 300 or 400 in public schools in the country right now, but only a very small number of independent schools. Among the small number of independent schools using the PISA test for schools, which is more formally called the OECD test for schools based on PISA, is Mount Vernon Presbyterian, right there in Greater Atlanta. And I think this is a really cool test. This is just a test you give once in a student's lifetime for your 15-year-olds, usually your 9th and 10th graders. You might not give it every year. You might give it every 2 or 3 years. It's a very comprehensive test and gives you a very comprehensive report. So you wouldn't need to do it every year necessarily, but you could if you wanted. And this is a test. It's exactly the same test. Modified only slightly in format, as is given every 3 years triennially to 70 or 80 countries around the world to measure how different countries are doing in their academic effectiveness and in the success of their school programs. But this test is very much designed to be a higher order thinking, problem-solving test. And they have great challenging problems. They're rich, they're interesting, they're fascinating. You have to sort of go back and forth from various graphs and charts and writing and statistics and essays, and then make sense of them both in multiple choice questions and in open-ended response questions, short essay questions. There's dozens of questions like this on a PISA test where students have to really think through them. They have to actually make inferences. Why is the author chosen to start the graph at this point? Or in this, what are the assumptions of a figure there? Or compare, information from two different charts. It's really good question writing skills. It really is about applied problem solving. It's not at all about what students have been taught to know and memorize. It's how they can use their reasoning skills to solve problems. And then you get a very broad, this is a 160-page report that you get with tons of comprehensive information, detailed, extensive rubrics that you can use, again, use back into your school as influences and informants. You get proficiency ratings for your students, not just the median performance, but what was their spread? Were there, how many of your students are really performing at the very top level of international performance? How many of them are really below baseline and in need of crisis? It's not just about the median or the average. It's about sort of the spread of student performance. You get how your students do compared to schools around the world. Are your students, if for many independent schools, it's just not that much to say that you're doing better than American kids generally, or, than Americans. Increasingly, our parents want to know, yeah, but how do they do compared to kids in China? How do they do compared to kids in Singapore and Japan and South Korea and Finland and the rest? And you can get that data through the PISA test for schools as well. You get broad, and you can even ask the question, I don't care about how my students did at the median compared to the kids in the median in China. I want to know whether my highest performing kids, whether I have, my brightest kids are performing at the international level or not. And you can get that kind of data in these kinds of graphs. This is a 160-page report. There's so much here. And then they also do surveys inside the PISA test for schools, surveys about disciplinary climate and or about teacher-student relations or about student motivation. And you can look and see how your school stacks up to schools like yours. And so this is a graph of just schools in your socioeconomic brackets. So it's not independent schools per se, but if you have a very affluent student body, like many, but not all private schools do, you can get comparisons just to other kinds of schools with very affluent student bodies. And then you can look at, and you can see the line of regression here, that if you have a more positive disciplinary environment, then you get higher reading scores. And so you want to move your school, and you want to move your school up on the y-axis towards greater reading, and you might want to move their disciplinary climate upwards, up to the right, because that's how to generate that greater performance, is this evidence would suggest. There's just a lot of different interesting information here. I'm not going to take time here because I got to keep moving. So we're going back to the other side of the equation. How do we measure students' non-cognitive, how do we measure culture, climate, and non-cognitive skills? And one thing we do is we use surveys. And I think every student, many schools are doing parent surveys. Many schools are doing alumni surveys. Some schools do internal, their own homemade, if you will, student surveys. But I think there's an obligation, really, just about, to use a standardized external data source. The HSSE and the middle school HSSE version really only cost about $1 per kid. They take 30 minutes of time. You could do it every other year if you wanted. It's not really an expense of time or money in any significant way, but you can get student voice. You can get student perspective. You can get an understanding of how do students view your student experience? How do they view their learning? How do they view the social experience of the school? Is it safe? Is it free from bullying? Is it trusting? What is their emotional environment? Do they feel confident? Do they feel like they're growing? You can get that from their point of view, their perception. This is a survey. This is a self-report survey, and it matters. Even John Hattie, the author of Visible Learning and perhaps the single greatest expert on the planet about what matters in learning, says we need to include student voice. It is reliable. It doesn't just go to personality. Oh, I don't like this teacher, and it can be a major resource. You get data points about, how do students feel in your school? You could compare how students in your school feel about their experience to all public schools that took the HSSE and to the NAIS norms. And this is the single question that often independent schools use as there's hundreds, there's scores of questions in the HSSE, but this is the one they often focus on the most. The questions and the reporting is broken out into 3 categories, including academic engagement, social engagement, and emotional engagement. These are things that we all care about in our schools, and we want to know how students are doing. And then I did a series of interviews of HSSE users last winter as part of my NAIS report preparation, and heard a lot of great things about how useful and valuable the HSSE is to school leaders, to program leaders, to really to work hard on this project. And myself, there were things I really wanted to move the needle on. And so I, for instance, at the school I headed a few years ago, wanted to improve students' perception of being creative in the classroom. And so we got one measurement in 2009. We put some programs into place and grew it to the next year from 86 to 90. I wanted to grow more particularly our classrooms where we discussed, students perceived, reported they discussed questions with no clear answers. We moved that needle 10 points by really seeing that data, that original data point, setting goals, changing instructional methods, and then having a higher report. And then you get research, you get information about what students really care about, how they want to spend their time, what's exciting and engaging to them. It's really terrific. 2 other resources if you want to do surveys. To consider, I know of some independent schools that are using Tripod, independent schools in the Midwest and the West Coast. That's another survey outfit exercise where they actually survey students and survey teachers and survey parents, and then they do some fascinating aggregation and algorithms to combine those three data sources and reveal a whole lot about what's going on in your school from various perspectives. And it's a rich resource. It's a more expensive and more complex undertaking than the HSSE. It takes more time and effort, but there are schools that are really diving into that. There's a new survey company in education, just 2 years old now, I think, Panorama, which is sort of bursting onto the scene, and they have a dozen different kinds of formats of their student surveys. They're modular. You can mix and match different kinds of sections. They're quite affordable. They have a lot of students to generate their norm banks, and I think it's a more high-powered tool in a sense than the HSSE. It's not being embraced by NAIS particularly, so you won't get NAIS norms like you will for the HSSE to compare yourself to other independent schools. But I think they have a big private school norm category available to them, or they will soon, that could give you at least a relative read on that. But if you're looking at surveys, those are two other resources for you that I would recommend. Now into the social emotional learning assessments, students' non-cognitive skills, if you will. And the difference here between a survey and a non-cognitive skill is that they don't rely just on what students report. They don't rely just on how students view themselves. They have other kinds of questions or other kinds of formats that generate more data that gives you information about how students, more accurate, more reliable and valid, if you will, read on whether students have and are growing in these proficiencies. Than just a self-report would provide. And self-report systems have their place. They can be very valuable, but they also suffer from different kinds of biases. There's a big problem with so-called reference bias about to whom are students comparing themselves when they're answering questions just about themselves. These two next tools, the MSA, which is used by about 100 independent middle schools, and the Tessera, which isn't used by any yet because it's not on the market yet, they correct for reference bias and the faking problem of students just wanting to make themselves look good. The MSA measures these 6 qualities: teamwork, creativity, ethics, resilience, curiosity, and time management. They do so with asking students to report on themselves, students to answer scenario-based challenging questions. What would you do in this situation? How would you handle this situation? The MSA brings in a teacher rating system as well, in what's called a triangulated method, 3 different methods to measure each of these kinds of skills and strengths. I know schools that are using MSA really powerfully to give guidance to their whole program. They're crosswalking the MSA to what they talk about as being most important in their own school, and then they're infusing this model into everything they do around parent education, report cards, student conferencing, even disciplinary forums. That this is the way in which they're organizing their character education and social emotional learning program. They're using the data to identify opportunities to improve their outcomes. They're also gathering information on how best to improve the outcomes they're seeking. An example of that second one, I'm going to give an example of the first in a minute, is that a close study in many schools of students' math performance and the MSA measurement reveals that students with low time management score poorly on their math grades. But if you just help them on their time management, kids at the lowest quintile, the lowest 2 quintiles of time management do poorly on math. But if you get them into the 3rd quintile, they do much better in math, the correlations show, suggesting that it's very possible that if you can just, instead of drilling kids more and more on math, you can just help them with their organization skills and have the impact you're seeking on their math achievement. It sort of reveals, by close study, this data, all kinds of interesting and important avenues available to you to improve student learning. I worked with a school in Michigan, Detroit Country Day School, which has given me permission to share this story, where they found that their performance, and they're the blue bar there, they were well above average on time management. Their students were very organized, but they were below average on teamwork and on curiosity. You can see how those bars are to the left of the median. And so it gave them inspiration to go back and work on a new teaching and learning initiatives, such as project-based learning and inquiry-based learning, to strengthen students' teamwork and curiosity, because those were important to their school outcomes. And then lastly on this list, my gosh, the time, is the system we're working on called Tessera, which will be made public this summer, but we are seeking pilot schools right now, which measures, if you look in the bottom right there, drive and grit, organization and responsibility, teamwork and cooperation, composure and resilience, curiosity and ingenuity, and leadership and communication skills. And you can get a sense of how your students are performing in each area compared to other schools. You'll get these are the kinds of questions that kids are asked, the kinds of formats of the way the multi-method triangulated system works. You get comprehensive school reporting on each skill area. You get it compared grade by grade on how students are doing. You get it compared boys and girls on how students are doing. And then students will get their own reporting systems. This will be for grades 6 through 12, and it'll be extended to upper elementary soon, on students on how well they're doing. And then students will get guidance, as you can see here. Here's how to improve in this area. If it's organizational responsibility, here's ways you can improve in these areas. And more guidance here. So it's very formative, it's very growth oriented, it's used a lot of growth mindset language, very developmental. But if we care about these things in our school, organization and teamwork and curiosity, we need systems to check how kids are doing, and then systems to help kids grow. And this is what that does. I'm shifting gears here now from discussing particular tools to discussing systems in your school to make the most use of them. And I'm borrowing, I'm making more references to other resources. This is the outline from Grant Wiggins and Jay McTeague, how if you want to put this, put a more formal, more organized system of assessment into your schools, you start with your vision for student learning, your mission, what you're calling for, what your promises are. And then you make sure, number 2, to collect your evidence, put your action plan into place, and adjust your plan from there, organizing your system of improvements as he describes there. This was the system we built for the mission skills assessments, and I'm not going to talk about all 10 of these approaches, but this is the mission skills assessment user's guide is freely available online, and you can just do a search for that, mission skills assessment user's guide, and it spells this out in 4 or 5 pages. But really, you want to have an organized system of determining what it is you want to measure, what are you going to put in place for those measurements, how are you going to develop your faculty, work with other schools, and then go and study the data and make your improvement plans. More particularly, when you're trying to select your own portfolio. Grant Wiggins talks about it that way, other schools do. What will be your portfolio of assessment tools? What will be your the systems the methods you want to put in place to ensure you're measuring your mission and using them appropriately. I've built this little process. I've done this with several schools as a consultant. It takes 6 to 12 months. We do inclusive processes with the board, with the faculty, with the administrative team. We have a multi-member committee. We study carefully the school's mission, its philosophy, its promises. We look at how we want to use assessment, what are the purposes of a measurement and assessment in your school. You create a grid of both the promises and the purposes. You then research all the assessment tools out there on the market today, or many of them, and then you fill in the grid and you review, prioritize, and select the grid, items on the grids for your school portfolio. This is, I'm just going to show this very quickly. This is a grid that we did at, I masked out the name of the school, but this is a grid we did at one school where we had the purposes of assessment across the top, horizontally. And then we had the promises of the school, what the school's mission called upon it to deliver down the bottom left. And then at first, all the internal boxes were empty, but then we slowly filled them in with various options. And then as we worked to try to have a complete grid of assessment and measurements that met our purpose. And then once you've selected what your tools are, you need a system for using your tools and putting them into proper effect. And there's many resources to look to for that. I really enjoy this book. I really highly recommend this book, Data-Wise in Action, which is a terrific, handy, not too long guide for how to have a better culture of data use in your schools and an ongoing cyclical process. This book has Leaders of Their Own Learning is another cyclical process that's highly recommended and can give you guidance on how to make this work. Data-Driven Leadership has one, and I've been working with schools and trying to get a calendar in place. This summer is about reviewing what you want to measure and selecting your important measurement methods. The fall is collecting or evaluating that. The winter is you go in and intervene, and then you evaluate the effectiveness. You need a system. It might not be the one particularly be modified for every school, but you want a calendar, cyclical, well understood, ongoing process to drive the flywheel of continuous improvement in your school. Whew, there we go. Let's go to questions, Damien. Sorry that was a little too long.
Jonathan, I think we're going to give you a chance to catch your breath while we try and catch ours as well. That was a staggering, just a staggering and somewhat overwhelming picture of some of the tests that are available, how to assess them, and what types of things you might be able to do with them. I'd encourage the audience, if you will, to send a chat question. Just make sure that you send it to everyone, and we can see it as it pops up. But in the meantime, as we're waiting for some potential questions that might pop up, Jonathan, I'd love it if you'd talk a little bit more about that selection process, and maybe something that I think is in the news today in a variety of states is the idea of over testing and how you might balance that with the needs of what you're really trying to accomplish.
Sure, of course. And the concern about over testing is a concern of public education, and by and large, not exclusively. We have a concern with our high school students in 11th, 12th, maybe sometimes starting in 10th grades, of over testing them with perhaps too many AP tests, of AP tests plus SAT tests plus ACT tests plus SAT2 tests. The college admissions process can be overwhelming, and we ought to be cautious about not overloading our upper high school students. But by and large, the concern from first or second grade through 8th or 9th grade coming from the public schools is about public school districts that are giving not just 5 to 10 hours of mandated state accountability achievement tests, but also giving another 10 to 20, even 20 to 40 hours of interim and benchmark assessments administered by the district to check on progress towards those state accountability testing. And when you start adding that up, you are looking at a public school fourth grader sometimes taking 30 tests, standardized tests a year, as much as 30 or 40 hours a year. And that's not what anybody wants. That's not, most states are working hard to move away from that because they've recognized that. But when I'm suggesting that we give students, a fourth grader, 8 or 10 hours of testing a year, that's a far cry from 40 to 50 hours in the public school overdone component. I think that we all, when we drive our car, we check our dashboard all the time. We check for how fast we're going. We check for how much gas we have. We check our engine. We need to be checking regularly how we're doing in whatever it is we're doing. And I think we shouldn't let some of the overblown angst of the public school, which really has gone overboard, inform what's happening in private schools, where by and large that's just not the case. The second thing is that many of the systems I'm mentioning here, particularly on the non-cog and character sides, are not felt by kids, are not experienced as the same kind of stress and extreme kind of testing. A survey, a non-cognitive assessment doesn't stress a kid out. It's not hard work. They're answering questions about themselves or their perception of school. They enjoy thinking about these questions. We've done lots of focus groups with kids. They don't mind them. It's not a problem for them in the same way. So I wouldn't lump them in together either. It's true that with CWRA, with 11th and 12th graders, you have to sort of, that's the biggest challenge. That's a great test to administer to an 11th and 12th grader for your school purposes. And kids do see it, by and large, as a different kind of testing experience, not the same old SAT. But it does come at a time when 11th graders are stressed about AP tests, and that's the biggest sort of friction point, I think, that I do acknowledge is a concern.
Yeah. I know that you are a fan of the MAP test, as am I. It's a test, I know that you mentioned it before, that was the first one that you talked about. It really got its start in the Pacific Northwest, and the schools that are part of SAIS that use it most prevalently are actually the international schools in Mexico. But a question has rolled in that says, I've read that the MAP test may not be the most suitable assessment for higher achieving students. Can you address that?
Yeah, I've heard that too, particularly for the highest grade levels, for 8th, 9th, and 10th grades. MAP runs K through 12, but rarely do schools use it after 9th or 10th grade, particularly independent schools. I have heard some schools with very high achieving student bodies feel like they're maxing out some of their kids are maxing out at the highest grade levels. I've talked to the MAP people. I've spent time in their headquarters. They're working on that. I think they're gonna build out the ceiling a little higher in their adaptive systems. But I think that's a fairly narrow band, problematic band. Your highest grade level uses for your highest performing kids. And perhaps, depending on your school and your situation, you would phase it out in 7th, 8th, or 9th grade as being of less value to you, while still finding it very, very helpful in grades 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, depending on your particular uses. And of course, every school has to make its own decision. But I've heard other schools say they don't have that problem at all. Other schools with good, successful students. So. It hasn't really, I mean, it's not that they've never encountered it, but it hasn't sort of cramped their utilizations.
We are out of time. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us. We look forward to seeing you at some of our events in the future. There's a lot coming up this summer with lots of SAIS events, and would encourage you to come to some or send some folks our way. Thanks again, everyone. Have a great day and enjoy the rest of the week.